Prime Minister, your speech went a little bit over time. Are you happy to take a couple more questions?
Oh, please.
Excellent.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
Excellent. Good.
Hello and welcome to The Pouch, the publicly rejected phone call of podcasts that helps the average Aussie try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg, glad I'm not Bridget McKenzie Savage.
And I'm Jake in quarantine, Far Wharton. On today's episode, we give you your essential as water weekly roundup of Australian political news. And Greg asked the tough questions.
Jake, this week while we are in quarantine in The Pouch, I want to know how the Australian government is going to keep me safe from the coronavirus. I want to know about maybe some previous viruses that we've had in Australia, and I want to know how I'm going to be safe when I eventually leave this pouch and go back to work. All right, Jake. Well, I know that the week's big news, of course, is the coronavirus, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. We'll discuss the ins and outs of how the government is going to keep us safe from that, trying to regain our trust after what we might refer to as the bushfire fiasco. But first, the third part of our 245-part series, has Bridget McKenzie resigned yet?
Well, the answer is no, Greg, but potentially it's getting close. An interesting thing about the National Party of Australia, they don't tend to fire their members. In fact, one of the long-running mainstays over the last couple of decades is the whole Labor Party's sick of their leader because of news polls, and so we're going to depose them, etc. Liberal Party's sick of their leaders because of news polls or whatever program. Let's try and depose them. Nationals don't have that issue. Essentially, it's a long-standing thing with the Nationals. Once a party leader is done with their leadership, they will step down. Similarly with members, if they're no longer wanting to contest their seat, they will voluntarily step down. But I was unable to find any occasions of people being fired. And in this case, it seems that, it really seems that the case has become so toxic that it's possible that the Prime Minister may need to make a call, may need to call Michael McCormack, the leader of the Nationals and the Deputy Prime Minister, and see whether they can work something out, because this scandal is getting hot.
Yeah, I think there was talk over the last couple of days about there being an email directly from the president. There's my American politics side coming out. There was an email directly from the Prime Minister's office, which said, we need to focus on these particular electorates, which were marginal seats. And we know that, look, like I've said before, I try and come at these things from a different angle to try and see both sides of the story. So this week, I went straight to the source of news from the other side, which, news from the other side of news that I'm used to anyway. And I went straight to Andrew Bolt. And, this is what he had to say about his disappointment with the handling of this situation.
But one thing particularly infuriates me about the Morrison government's sports fraud scandal. And it's this, the thought that the government has treated hundreds and maybe thousands of volunteers around the country with contempt. Now, I'm talking about volunteers, the mums and the dads and the coaches and the administrators in sports clubs around Australia who thought that their government would play by the rules.
What he was most frustrated about was all of the hours that were spent, the volunteers, the parents, the coaches, all putting together these applications for these grants and getting knocked back, which I think they were independently assessed by the inquiry, and they gave all of the applications a rating, all of the ones that were like 80 something or higher.
And above, yep.
None of them got it.
Yes, and there were a lot of stories this week about clubs that were that had plenty of money, that received plenty more money through the grant scheme to do whatever upgrade. But there were also plenty of stories from clubs that were highly recommended, as you said, from the independent arbitrator of the program, Sports Australia, that got nothing, and missed out on the program despite that very high rating. So it is very difficult to understand, how this has occurred. But look, this coming week there will be the outcome of the investigation from Prime Minister and Cabinet Office. And we'll just have to see what happens, because of course later this week, of course, we will also have the reconvening or the first sitting day of Parliament for the calendar year. So I'm almost expecting, Greg, that Sunday insiders will have an interview with the Prime Minister and Michael McCormack, or some combination of one or the other, and there'll be some form of contrition around perhaps that there is actually something that needs to happen with Minister McKenzie, because it is not looking good, and there are just so many cases of highly deserving clubs that have missed out here.
They've really dug their heels in too. Like they're not sort of so much sticking, beside her. They're not so much sticking by her. I know that at the what do you call it? The National Press Club
this week,
speech that Scott Morrison gave the speech for this week. He said that, and I've written the quote down here. He said that no rules were broken, but that the guidelines were not followed. So they're not letting her go because they're not letting her go because of the fact that there were no rules broken, but they're sort of umming and ahhing about the fact that some guidelines were not followed. And I think that it's an interesting political move at this stage, because it's obvious that she has some dirt on her hands, so to speak, and that that they've got to be seen to be doing something, but they want to be seen to be have some solidarity around the issue as well, and to be seen to be united, have a united front. The fact that, like you mentioned, it's part of the National Party rather than the Liberal Party. So Scott Morrison is trending a particularly fine political line. However, I don't think that excuses any of this sort of the behaviour at the moment. Given that look, you've got Anthony Albanese tweeting every second of every day at the moment. He's just tweeting out that she needs to go.
That is the suggestion from many in the public at the moment. A lot of the commentary is that this situation has become so toxic, the level of pork barreling was so blatant that she just has to go.
Speaking of following guidelines, the government this week also decided that they were going to mention guidelines, but this time they were actually following the guidelines. So they're giving out that, sometimes when you go to the doctor and you get a prescription, and you go to the chemist and you decide that you're going to, get what you were prescribed, and you go, well, this is either going to cost me, $700 or it's going to cost me $7, and I'll be pleasantly surprised. And that's because of our pharmaceutical benefits scheme, which of course means that at some point someone is storing your data, and this data is being handed off to some authorities. Is that right, Jake?
That's right, yes. It was announced this week after a very long investigation that the Australian government has been releasing highly sensitive medical records to police through a so-called secret regime. So essentially the Department of Human Services, they every year they field very large volumes of requests for PBS, or pharmaceutical benefit scheme, as you mentioned, and MBS, Medicare benefits schedule items data from state and federal policing agencies. So the interesting thing here is the records can paint a very detailed history of a person's personal medical history, including things like their mental health state. Are they seeking counselling? Are they currently taking mental health medication? Do they have things like HIV or any other sexually transmitted disease? Have they ever had an abortion? It's highly sensitive medical information that, generally speaking, organisations like the Department of Health that operate things like the what's it called, My Health Record, they store that all in one place, absolutely. But any time that information is required by policing services, those services must go and seek a warrant, which essentially means that they're going down they're sitting with a judge. They're saying we require access to these things. We have enough evidence, and the judge can arbitrate and decide whether their case has merit in order to provide that information or provide access to that information. The policy that the Department for Human Services has is essentially 16-year-old guidelines that simply have not kept up with public interest around access to health information and privacy around that. The guidelines allow for the release of information where necessary, quote, in the public interest.
That would have to do with things like crime or well-being, or I imagine that's part of their guidelines for releasing this information. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, because these guidelines are 16 years old, and frankly they've not been updated, so we honestly do not understand the intention in which they were written originally. But they've survived different ministers, different political parties and political persuasions, different administrations, directors, etc. So because it has survived for so long and not kept up with best practice around this premise, unfortunately, it is rife for personal interpretation or departmental interpretation. And certainly you can imagine that if a police officer or a police department were to make a compelling enough case that a judge might have a different view on, given lack of precedence or plenty of other legal information, this sort of information could just be released by a department without consideration of the broader consequences of releasing such potentially private information.
All right. Well, we do know that the government they absolutely love collecting some data on us, don't they? So last year we saw that they'd collected enough data via the means that they use for Centrelink data collection to get information on people to send out a few debts, which was known as the Robo debt scandal. That was found to be illegal from my understanding, but now it's sort of they've revamped the way that I can now get on the dole. Is that right? They've revamped the way that I get my money for the dole rather than get on the dole.
So now that they've found the so-called Robo debt scheme unlawful following legal challenge in the federal court, the Social Services Department and portfolio is seeking ways to recuperate money that they believe is being wrongly given to, essentially undeserving welfare recipients, to the amount of around $2 billion in so-called wrongful payments. So the way that they're going to do this, if it's implemented, obviously it has to pass through consideration, review, etc., before becoming policy or law, whichever
all those
route
really
they take.
Exciting things. They're
exactly,
so exciting,
all that
things,
fun stuff. They? Exactly. Well, I mean, personally, I thrive on that stuff. It'll require welfare recipients to report their actual earnings each fortnight, which essentially means that the Social Services Department is no longer going to use that principle of extrapolation. You earn a certain amount, in this fortnight, and then for the next 4 weeks you've got absolutely no work. So it's really,
so there's no more projection, right? So they're going to it's going to be automatically. I read about it. It said it's going to be automatically populated as well. In some cases, the same way that my tax is now automatically populated for the ATO. Yeah. So they're probably. I mean, it's a little bit easier, right?
To your point, Greg, all of that time spent trying to find facts, figures, pay slips, etc., uploading documentation or handing it in, going to visit Centrelink and other similar arbitrators. That's all time that you could be spending, looking for jobs or studying to reskill, etc. So absolutely. Any way to remove bureaucracy from these types of things, make it more streamlined and easier on the people, so that they can spend the majority majority of their time looking for work or looking to recover so that they can get back to work, or just, taking the stress out, because a lot of the welfare recipients are, people who are still at school, whose, for example, parents don't earn enough money to support them essentially as students. So, it's an important, having a social safety net is one of the foundational pillars, I feel, of Australia, and it's such an important thing. So any way that we can find to streamline things while still improving the economic situation of the Australian budget is a pretty good thing.
Especially while we're in this sort of crossover as well, where some of the older generation might not have the skills necessary to keep up with the, evolving workforce. And I'm probably part of that now, to be fair. So, I think that, there might be some crossover. So you might find that more people are in that sort of zone of what they refer to as underrepresentation in the workforce. So you might have a great set of skills. You might have your unique set of skills like Liam Neeson, is it? Anyway, and look, if he was here, he'd probably go on the workers, payments as well.
No. He's got a very specific set of skills, which can be used in a number of.
That's what I mean. Like, they're outdated. They're outdated now. You just get on Facebook, you just get on your social media and just start going, rah, rah, that's your revenge. Like, you don't have to worry about actual revenge.
I reckon Liam Neeson would make a great podcaster, actually.
Well, why don't you get him on the show? Get him on the show. I'm sure we can wrangle some sort of political
news
news out
week
of him.
we talk to Liam Neeson.
This next story, Jake, you sent it through as a story that we might like to discuss, and I got to be honest with you, man, it really tugged at the old heartstrings. So I might let you discuss this one. It was pretty full on. It was shocking to find out that these sorts of things are happening in Australia.
Yeah, so Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, announced this week that he is looking at enforceable solutions to prevent the exploitation of Aboriginal artists. And this all follows a report late last year of elderly Aboriginal artists being kidnapped and forced to paint for a dealer in Alice Springs. And so back in 2018, there was a report that was released on the impact of inauthentic art. People essentially co-opting Australian or Indigenous art, and trying to write or trying to claim that it is actual Indigenous art from Indigenous artists where it's not. This report found that, or provided several recommendations, including laws very similar to those that are being proposed by Minister Ken Wyatt. So the idea behind this is essentially it should prevent the so-called, it's this term called carpetbagging, which essentially means that you are, appropriating someone else's cultural artifact or someone else's cultural, thing essentially for yourself.
So that's not the actual kidnapping itself.
No, so it's not part of the kidnapping, but it does refer to this whole premise of people appropriating the cultural artifacts of a culture for their own profit. So in this case, people either kidnapping people in order to have them create drawings that will create art that they can sell on in the international markets, or in fact just essentially creating derivative art based on or directly copying First Nations people's art.
Yeah, I think the thing that really got to me about this particular story is, we live in such a great nation, and we had our Australia Day holiday last weekend. We had our Pouch the Podcast holiday special the other day for Australia Day, and, it's a day of division, isn't it? It's a day where you either sort of celebrate what it's great to be, with all the great things about Australia, or you're sort of out in the streets and you're saying, look, this is terrible, we shouldn't have it on January 26th, or you're somewhere in the middle where you're sort of just doing, but either way, it's a day of division. it's a day of, polarity within and without. And I feel like this as well, because we're sort of going about our days here. Like, I live in the Blue Mountains, I go to work, I do all these things, but then there's these tremendously terrible things happening in our country as well. And it's really hard to sort of admit that this is happening because it's so big. It's such a big problem. It's hard to know what to do next, I guess. It becomes overwhelming in a sense to know that these sorts of things are happening in our own country.
Artists often are, known as people who struggle, people who struggle either for their art or just to have their art recognised. And to see a group of people who should be, significantly revered, because artists in Indigenous cultures are often the ones who carry forward the stories of their ancestors' generations. So it's just not fair that that they be subjected to such awful situations.
Well, Jake, shall we shift gears a little bit and shall we start getting into the proverbial nuts and bolts? There you go. I got it right this week. The proverbial nuts and bolts of what everyone's thinking about. Shall we start chatting about the coronavirus? And I know that you and I are in this, the incubation stage in our little pouch here. We're safe and sound. But, at some stage we're going to have to come out, probably, do a couple of days of work or something like that. How am I going to be safe? How is the government keeping me safe? They've had a bit of a trial run with SARS in the past. How did that fare?
Yeah, well, not just SARS. There was H1N1, which was otherwise known as swine flu. But SARS was in SARS was in 2003. They had H1N1, which was in 2009. Relatively recently, I suppose, had MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which was in 2012. So,
I don't know about that one.
Oh well, it's a fascinating one. It's anyway, it's not that fascinating, but it is SARS and MERS are from the same group of viruses called coronaviruses. The difference between the viruses themselves within the coronavirus family is essentially how they transmit from person to person.
What is the mortality rate of coronavirus? Is that why they call it novel coronavirus?
Well, no, novel is just new. Novel just means new. So I assume at some stage it'll get a sexy name, like Hubei virus or something like that.
Right.
Who knows what it'll be called, but it might be called fish virus or something like that. Although,
yeah, but it'll sound better in Latin.
Yes, everything sounds better in Latin. Absolutely.
All right, so I get off a plane from China and I'm here and I have a snotty nose and I'm feverish, I'm nauseous, I have lumps under my arm. I don't know what happens to coronavirus victims, but I've obviously got something there that's a bit inexplicable. What happens to me next?
Well, they make the inexplicable explicable, thankfully. So it's been said in the last couple of days, the Australian federal government and individual state governments have deployed heat cameras or heat sensing cameras that are able to tell whether the people walking through the gates from their planes have an elevated temperature. Now, the real unknown here is whether the information from China around a so-called 14-day incubation period is correct or not. Because if the 14-day incubation period is correct, then, you can get on a plane, you can fly to pretty well any country in the world, you can go out for, another 12 days dancing every single night, and then you can turn up really, really sick. So, the thing that the Australian government is doing here, and, I'll put to sort of one side what they're trying to do to extricate the Australians living or currently on holiday or residing in Hubei province.
I think that's sort of all over the news too, isn't it? Like, everyone's sort of a bit aware of what's happening there. They're going to Christmas Island. They're I think they have to pay $1,000 or something for the privilege.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some interesting things around there. For example, they will, they're hoping to get people on a 747 and flight direct to Christmas Island, but unfortunately Qantas have stymied that and said that's just simply not possible. 747 can't land there. But and there's of course the notes from doctors saying that essentially it's not appropriate because it's 2,000 kilometres from the nearest major hospital that has the ability to treat major infections like this. So
there are parts of this that do sound like one of those dodgy, end of the world type virus movies, isn't there?
And the interesting thing here, Greg, is, and I cannot overstate this. The commentary coming out that we can see, in the media. And released on public government websites, etc., seems to be pointing to the premise that this is serious, and they are treating it. The federal and state governments are treating it as extremely serious. And I think that probably points to the fact that thus far, when you look at the statistics for previous outbreaks like SARS, for example, which was another coronavirus, it killed over 770 people, and it infected around 8,000 people. Well, this new virus has infected over 8,000 people already, and it's really only been about for just a bit over a month.
Right.
While the death toll, as we are recording this, is only at about 250 and isolated to people in China. It seems that this combination of factors is contributing to the premise that our Australian government is treating this as extremely serious.
Well, while we've been chatting, Jake, a little bit of pre-show conversation that we had, I received a tweet saying that Scott Morrison was now live. I've checked it out, and apparently he's announced that Chinese tourists will no longer be permitted to enter Australia amid the outbreak, and that you'll only be allowed back in if you're a citizen of Australia. So, that's a huge step to take, especially when we were so close to having a surplus in the economy. This is not a great sign combine that with the bushfires. I mean, gosh, this is the last thing that we needed. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you, Greg, I don't want to cynically look at the fact that the federal government, particularly Scott Morrison himself, fronting the media so regularly to discuss, the coronavirus outbreak.
Running from the National Press Club speech that he gave straight downstairs to get to the, Look,
I don't want to look at this cynically as hey, bushfires, you weren't there. Hey, Bridget McKenzie, you're not acting. To look over there, we've got a coronavirus outbreak that we need to address.
No,
I don't
not doing that at all. He's not doing that at all. He does it for the benefit of our health and safety.
No, exactly. But I mean that seriously. I do not want to be cynical about this because, you do expect a certain level of leadership from your political leaders.
Yeah,
so we're certainly all hopeful of that. Exactly. Yeah. Political leader, you become a leader and you lead. What we hope to see from our political leadership is that they are being considered in their approach to solutions. They think of an idea, they get a whole bunch of the smartest people in the room into a room, and they figure out how to fulfill that idea. And along the way, that idea changes shape. They work out the logistics, and in the end, they come up with a fully fledged idea to get for example, people from Hubei province in China to Christmas Island, or just to Australia in general, where they can be appropriately quarantined and treated, for whatever period of time is necessary. But what it seems that we have here is just a little bit of, media frontage with not all of the ideas fleshed out. And unfortunately that's why that's why we see a lot of commentary around this premise of cynicism, essentially, that there is a lot of bad stuff happening. And here is something where the government can show, effective leadership. But it'll be interesting to see what comes of that.
So if I'm here in Australia and I get some symptoms, then I'm going to be quarantined, right? I'm going to be taken to a hospital. I'm going to be put in a white room with people wearing hazmat suits and, blue curtains everywhere. That's how I imagine it anyway in my head. And, or if I'm overseas, essentially now, if I'm a tourist, I can't come into Australia. If I'm a citizen, I can come in, but I'm probably going to be checked out for a little bit. If I've already been in China for a long time and I possibly come into contact with someone, then I'm going to be shipped off to Christmas Island for 2 weeks.
Yeah, the response is serious, and I suppose this is how you can tell, that it is serious and that they are treating it seriously and not just as sort of a cynical distraction. But the fact that they are denying entry to non-citizens coming from China is a dead giveaway that they are seriously taking precautions against this. We've seen these sorts of things in the future with, in 2009, the H1N1 swine flu.
You said seen these things in the future.
We've seen these things in the future. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was like, we've seen these things in the future. This is going to be great.
This is a great podcast.
I haven't seen this
love
movie
this.
before.
We're going to keep listening. We're solving future crime, Greg. So we have seen things like this in the past with things like the H1N1 influenza, the swine flu, so-called swine flu in 2009, where things like airports were restricted, where they deployed those thermal sensing cameras, and where antiviral drugs were stockpiled and deployed. And we've learned a lot of stuff from those previous, interactions with global pandemics. But, this is serious, and it seems that our Australian and our federal and state governments are taking it really quite seriously. As you say, though, if you detect any symptoms, the government advice is to self-quarantine yourself for as long as it takes to get through the symptoms, to notify the disease centres in order to get appropriate testing, and if necessary, to be quarantined in a hospital, which is probably appropriate given the potential death rate for this thing. But the thing with this particular coronavirus is we don't currently know how it spreads. We don't know where,
that's not very handy, Jake. That's not very handy at all.
No, exactly. It's not handy. In fact, the virus itself might be extraordinarily handy because, one of the ways that things like swine flu and SARS transmitted was it was spread by droplets, but it was more by contact. So, somebody has a nose sniffle and they scratch their nose, and then they touch a bar on the train, and somebody else touches that bar, and then they, scratch their nose, and all of a sudden it's transmitted. So, these viruses, unfortunately, can have an extraordinarily high virulence rate. You've just got to be cautious. But as you were saying, Greg, go about your daily routine. Hop on a train, hop on a kangaroo. Whatever it happens to be. I don't want to be
seen to be giving that advice either. Like, I don't think people should be taking any sort of medical advice from this podcast. I think we need to be very clear about, because we record this one day and then we sort of release it the next. So, I mean, our worst fear at the moment is that this is just, they've solved coronavirus and that Bridget McKenzie is resigned, and because otherwise we're going to be up very early re-recording this. So, well, I feel okay. So thank you, Jake. Thank you for making me feel a little bit safer to go outside next week. And thank you so much for talking to me about delicious pork barreling, Jake. Gosh, we do, I do love some delicious pork barreling.
Yeah. We're running out of applesauce though.
Are you going to share our recipe to our Patreon subscribers?
I think we must. It's look,
we don't actually have a Patreon. It just felt like a thing.
That's true.
It felt
like a thing that we should say. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Doing a podcast,
you got to have a Patreon. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Greg, and thanks very much, listeners. I always love researching the topics for this show. You can, of course, hit the subscribe button and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook just by searching for The Pouch, the podcast.
And if you want to direct any of your friends to listen to the show, you can do so by going to thepouchthepodcast.com, where they can choose their favorite player thingamabobadoo and subscribe. their own way, their unique way. We try and carve a path for all walks of life here at the Pouch, the podcast.
We're all inclusive, absolutely.
Unless you don't have the internet, in which case that's a bit tough. That's a bit tough. I don't know. We'll get it.
In which case, I'm frankly very unsure of how you're listening to this right now.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to pay someone who's going to transcribe every show, and they're going to get that to you on a piece of paper so you can read that.
Mail it to you. Yeah.
In your non-internet world.
That's exactly how inclusive we are. But of course, if you do have access to one of those apps that allows you to rate podcasts, please do consider rating this podcast. It really helps.
Yeah. Only select few people we want to rate the podcast. Like if they've gone through the whole show and they're just like, these guys, I'd rather an email.
I would rather a strongly worded letter. Get me a stamp.
Look, it's just that, with those ratings, right? Like you go into an app or something or a podcast and it's like, Joe Blogs 4 years ago wrote this thing about this app doesn't work and this podcast is rubbish, and it's had 4 years to change, and it's still the top rated.
It's still there.
It's still the first thing you see as soon as you go into the app store or something. It's like Anyway, they're still talking about swine flu in their review. We've moved on from there.
Oh, that was so last decade.
All right, Jake, thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting with you again next week. And, it's obviously a day of division where you reflect on... Yeah, you okay?
I may have just dropped a beer bottle, yes. I'm perfectly fine. It just fell on the floor.
I got a panic then when you didn't answer. I was like, I'm going to have to bloody message his wife or something. And then, anyway,
he's fallen over.
Call 000. I need to have 3 seconds to kill this fly. I have a fly in here, and I'm not afraid to admit that I'm going to kill it. So hang on. I got to
get it.
Half a can should do it.